Hello, everyone. This is Mr. Nobody bringing you another episode of Making Nobody Happy. And today I want to make a pitch to you. This is something that actually taken from something that I wrote probably 3 years ago. I'm not sure exactly how long it was. It was probably in the middle of the Trump presidency somewhere. So obviously a lot of time has passed. Politically, the wheel has turned a bit. Nevertheless, I don't find that my opinions on the subject have changed. And that subject is the importance of resisting all political extremes. So I just want to say that I feel the same obligation to fight extreme leftist culture, what some people would say woke culture, as I do to fight extreme right culture and some of the extremes that, particularly you see, not necessarily Trumpist sort of culture, but that's definitely some of it. Certainly at the time this was first really on my mind, that's what it was. You really saw the sides coalescing into these blocks that were opposed to each other. And I think Trump is just a personality around which things sort of coalesced. People coalesce around a sort of banner, and Trump was deliberately trying to market himself and make himself as a banner for that opposition. I'm not sure that he really did, because I don't know that he really had all the ideological depth, but I think as a symbolic center for it, he certainly did succeed in that area. Anyway, so as I say, I believe you actually need to resist both the far left and the farther right. In my opinion, they're really similar extremes of just differing strategies. I personally see value in the conservative and the liberal approaches, and I think that what they really are is approaches, their attitudes, their instinctive value structures. Really, there's something deeply psychological more than they are a specific set of beliefs or ideas, although they can coalesce in a particular time and place around a certain articulation of beliefs and ideas. And both of them are actively trying to balance out the other. They have an inherent combativeness and tension between them. They both also, I think, present a similar potential for going catastrophically wrong, although they might take very different routes to that result. Although I really think if you go far enough around one end of the spectrum, you just come right back around the other. The two extremes are actually far closer to each other than they are to almost anything else. They just might take different methodologies of it. But in the end, they'll start harmonizing, and it'll be very difficult to even tell what the difference between them is. Now, which side of this sort of left-right spectrum that people belong to is, to a large degree, and this is backed up by a lot of research, which you may or may not know, it is shaped by your innate personality. And then secondarily, the environment that you find yourself surrounded in, which both of those factors aren't necessarily things that you're in control of. So you might be someone who's born into a fairly conservative environment, or one that tends toward producing conservatism, but you might be someone who just by nature has a more liberal bent to your personality. And I don't think that means that you have to belong to one party or the other by necessity, that there's just some sort of either environmental or innate destiny. But these are strong influences, and they are influences from both directions, from certain innate things about yourself and also certain innate things about the environment that you're encountering and how you deal with it and how you respond to it. There's going to be a dance and exchange between those two things. You end up with people with very complex outcomes out of that. So you might end up becoming part of the more liberal wing of the conservative party that pulls it back from certain sorts of excesses or fills in certain corners of it, or you could be part of the more conservative wing of the Liberal Party, the spoke that pulls it from within to curb some of its excesses. And we actually need that, people. That's one of the things I don't like about what happened over the last I don't know, 6 years in both parties is this internal desire to purge and to create complete internal unity. And I understand why that's happened. I even understand historically why it's happened. I can even understand the arguments for it. But I think there is a fundamentally bad aspect to it, because it's basically saying we don't even need diversity within the party. Everybody needs to be at this furthest extreme within that group. I don't think that's right. Something happened to make. There's always a little bit of that. That's always a process that's going on. But it started happening way more just recently. At some point recently, people started sorting themselves way harder and way more effectively, maybe just because of changes in technology. In fact, I would guess that it's in a large part because of technology and because of technology's ability to accumulate and aggregate and even homogenize across this really wide spectrum. It allowed the most extreme elements within the parties to gain greater and greater traction and exposure than would have been possible in a more usual and mixed society, like the sort that occurs more naturally in society, and one where your ability to work with other people, including people who are different, and be reasonable and have to navigate that kind of complexity was actually more necessary for your success. It's actually easier to make people into a mob now, thanks to technology. So some of those skills of needing to navigate a complex and variable environment, including an environment of people, because people are most of the world that you actually experience. We don't actually need that as much. The new technology has made it possible that you don't really need to do that. You don't need to be that sort of person. And so that's led to this period of gradual purification and refinement, but in my opinion, not in a good way. And that's happened partly through conversion by convincing people they should really align themselves more closely with this idea of the ideological idea of purity within the group. And also forcibly by shaming people, by casting out anyone who resists. There's definitely been plenty of that. And so as the extremity of both sides rises, the funny thing is both sides actually become more and more justified in their arguments that there is a clear extreme threat from the other side that requires a deliberate response, a wartime response. It's a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy. People are becoming more and more right that we need to draw ranks together and man the barricades and expunge the traitors and resist the enemy. It really becomes this self-fulfilling prophecy. Whether the enemy was really there or not in the way that we imagined it in the beginning, they certainly are there now. You know, if you keep saying that the other side is the enemy and needs to be defeated and there's no room in society for them, and the reasons that compel people to be part of that group are, at least in some degree, fundamental to who they are, then you're declaring war on them personally, not just on their ideas. But those people aren't going to give in without a fight. You know, if you don't leave room for people to legitimately stand and have some territory, you compel them to fight for it. They will have to fight for it, and possibly be right about it. I mean, of course, you can interrogate what is really happening. Is there really a war on these people? What exactly is being done? I mean, that's the sort of thing that can be discussed. What really is the platform? What really is the end goal? How much of it is exaggeration? But at some point, if you develop this idea where there is no place for you legitimately to be anything but this, well, those people are going to have to fight to exist. There has to be some room in society for a legitimate conservative perspective. And there also has to be room for a legitimate liberal perspective, although using the word liberal, that has a certain meaning here in America. In other countries, it can even mean the opposite. Let's say left progressive, whatever, right, left. There needs to be room for a legitimate right, and there needs to be room for a legitimate left. There has to be room also within those parties for a legitimate mixed perspective, for people who are not just in the 5% of this, but are, well, I've got these things, and so I see, I'm going to navigate this corner of it, but still be part of it. The truth is, and this is something that I think also has to be recognized, is that not everybody can be some perfectly balanced, idealized moderate. Most people are going to be who they are. Biology itself seems to divide up the burden of keeping society balanced by spreading different qualities very unequally among different people. You got a more guarded person here to fill that niche, and a more open-handed person here to fill that niche. So what I think we need to do is open our eyes a little bit. It's time to actually learn to appreciate one another and realize that we actually have a need for both of these roles, because the world is a complex and changeable place that is dangerous, and it is wonderful, and so are the people in it. We need soldiers, and we need teachers, we need artists, and we need engineers, we need judges, and we need advocates. A society that embraces one and just completely expunges the other isn't being fair or honest about what humanity is or about the nature of the world. And eventually that's going to come back and bite them when the right, or more likely the wrong, circumstances roll along. And oops, we suppressed this. We got rid of this. We thought we didn't need this. You will be wishing you had kept those people. You will be wishing you had valued their work. And I actually believe that this true human diversity, this diversity, this internal diversity, transcends any just specific political structure or ideologies. You can find these influences, these attitudes, these values in every single society, however big, however small, in every different country, in every different time period. They take on different forms, they have different flavors and manifestations depending on the culture, the environment, their history, just the nature of those people. And sometimes things are working well, sometimes everyone is racing to make their contributions, and there's enough space provided that everyone is able to make it. And I have an interesting analogy about that, and it's one that I think I have talked about before, actually, with regard to politics. To me, it's a very useful metaphor, and it's that of riding a bicycle. You don't ride a bicycle by sitting straight on the bicycle. It's just not possible. It isn't possible. Riding a bicycle is too complicated an activity to actually be able to just straight sit on it. This also goes with what I was saying about, I don't necessarily think it's possible for us finite, limited humans to just be these perfect balanced moderates. We're actually made for a certain amount of dynamic complexity. So the way that you learn to ride a bike, and the way that Strider bikes, this is why Strider bikes actually teach you to ride a bike better than training wheels. Because training wheels, it's through balance. It's through learning to wobble. It's through learning to go from side to side. So the problem with actually training wheels is training wheels create artificial stability through limiting movement. They actually don't give you the ability to wobble. And so people actually learn faster on Strider bikes, which have no wobble. Sorry. They have no extra stability. Like if you just try to sit on a Strider bike, especially because it doesn't have pedals, you just fall over. And so it forces you to say, ooh, I have to wobble. I have to be dynamic. I have to learn where to put my foot down here, where to put my foot down here. I have to learn how to get myself going. I have to learn how to balance while I'm keeping going. It doesn't try to enforce a particular point of balance. And also when you're trying to navigate, if you've ever tried to use training wheels on something that isn't flat, let's say you're going down the sidewalk and periodically you have these driveways that are dips. Well, because you've been forced into this artificially static position, when the terrain goes like this, it's very hard not to just fall over. So this is the lessons. What you learn from riding a Strider bike is you actually learn to love the wobble. You learn to use the wobble. You learn to control the wobble. You learn to make it what allows you to go. And ultimately, you have to do that. Because at some point, the training wheels have to come off. If you're really going to ride a bike, you actually have to wobble. Because that's what people biking do. They're not going like this. They're constantly going like this every single second in this very dynamic pattern. But it allows them to move. Man, does it let them move. So you learn to balance that swing between opposing forces and sides. You'll actually learn how to balance them against each other to make forward momentum possible. And if you give too much to one side, your movement will be lateral instead of forward, and a crash to either side ends up looking about the same, whichever way you choose to take it. And that would also be something I'd say about the analogy. If you crash off one side of doing things, the actual end results are not going to look that different from falling off either side of your bike. Now, the best riders learn to use counterbalance to keep these opposing forces in their proper tension. There's a lot of complexity to it. As the road comes up to meet you, as it changes, as the bumps and curves come to meet you, sometimes, you lean harder to this side to get through it, and then you return to the equilibrium. So just imagine the impossible task of a rider who has decided ahead of time that there will never be a legitimate need to lean to the right or to the left. How do you think that bicyclist is going to do? Especially if they're facing anything other than like a perfectly flat, open parking lot where you're really going anywhere. Now, I live in the mountains. Everything here is up and down. The sidewalks are sometimes not even existing. They're, even along the outside of my own neighborhood, there is no sidewalk. It's dirt. This is a former wagon road that was just paved over that I live off of. It's an old road people would come up in the 1800s. And if you want to go anywhere around here, you're going through some serious terrain. You want to go places, you're going over the Rocky Mountains. Now, you will get to some spectacular places. But the idea of managing to get up through the mountains or down through them, flying on your bike, when you've predetermined there is never a legitimate need for me to go like this, you're not going anywhere. You are getting wrecked. So what I would actually say is, you can raise a lot of questions. Why did America do so well? There's so many answers to that story. There's some great books on that. And of course, de Tocqueville has a lot of wonderful things to say about that. But one thing that you just have to say, and de Tocqueville talked about this a lot, is that there's a certain brilliance about the American system of government that does actually help unleash potential. Basically, it's that it pays respect to the potential for both benefit and for disaster in all the differing approaches that Americans will bring to the table. You've got all these different states. They're all coming to the table. They've all got their ideas. They've all got their strategies. And the American system of government basically says, you know what? One thing, we all got to find a way to work together. We all got to find a way to unleash all of our potential. And you know what? I'm pretty sure that any one of these states that at the time were very separate entities could find unique ways to completely wreck everything or to make things go great. It very much depends. It's very conditional. So the American governmental system actually hamstrings the effectiveness of both sides. It puts obstacles in both their paths that limit the possibilities for either side to achieve complete dominance and so be able to pull the whole structure over that way. It really provides opportunities for both sides to, in a safe, limited, defined way, antagonize each other. It actually makes antagonism part of the central concept of government. Checks and balances. What are checks and balances other than antagonizing people's ability to get stuff done? That's why so many utopian societies, invested complete power in whatever it was that they thought would make everything work. Whether that was some sort of Congress or even an individual or particular party. The American governmental system is way more skeptical. Basically, no one gets exactly what they wanted because the founding fathers were very skeptical about a system like that. It didn't seem to them to fit the structure of reality or of humanity. So instead, they tried to create a system that reflected the actual challenges and complexities of life and of society. That struggle, that back and forth, that need for adaptation and cooperation. In some ways, their system, the American system of government, is actually way less idealistic than that of other revolutions because it didn't really come down on a single formula for one way of arranging things, some magic bullet that would just usher in the utopia. America is at least partially founded on the idea that it's not safe to actually give people what they want. If everyone of one sort got exactly what they wanted, it would actually hurt everybody, them included. And it was in everybody's interest to get a little less than what we all instinctively want. There's also an optimism to this approach. It's an optimism that by everybody getting just a little bit less than what any of us want, we might all as a whole get a lot more of what we all want and what we all really need. This sort of compromise, it's if anything, it's more like a complex relationship than it is like anything else. It's kind of like a town or a marriage. It's this very complex, dynamic relationship. So, and I do think that that's optimistic. That thought that maybe, just maybe, there's actually some value in our acts of balance and cooperation and compromise that will actually make us all collectively stronger. That by being restrained just a little bit, we'll actually come together better, stronger. We'll become more fulfilled versions of who we want to be than if we were just allowed to go completely our own way, completely unrestrainedly the bent of our hearts, And I feel like that sentiment of I should have my own way, the world should reflect me, I should have completely the bent of my own heart, I want all my own way, screw the rest of the world, is very much kind of becoming the American attitude. It's a very entitled attitude. It certainly doesn't respect the nature of humanity or the nature of the world in the way that I think the founding fathers did. It's more what I would call stupidly optimistic, unrealistically optimistic, and even in a way tragically and horribly and narcissistically optimistic. I actually think it's a horrible way to think about yourself and to think about the world, but it can seem really nice on the face of it. In the same way, this sort of tragic way of looking at the world that you see in the American government seems really rough and annoying and tragic on the face of it, but underneath, it's actually, there's something wonderful to it. There's actually something beautiful to it. And it's when you commit to one or the other that either the underlying ugliness or the underlying beauty begins to be revealed. So, as I said, there's in that tragic vision of our government, there's this implicit optimism. It's not all on the surface. On the surface, it's more of a pessimism. But there is this implicit optimism that with the right institutions that force us to live with some compromise, that we won't all just get frustrated and try to kill each other and go our separate ways. And that was a real concern when America was founded, that's exactly what was going to happen. And a lot of Europeans said, this is a crazy experiment, that's exactly what's going to happen. They won't be able to make compromises, they will get frustrated, they're all just going to kill each other and go their separate ways. And that's always a possibility. That is a very real possibility in life. That is in some ways the most natural possibilities. If we're all too divided, if we're all too different, if we're leaning too hard in whatever way that we're leaning, the mechanisms we're trying to ride forward might not be able to handle those kinds of strains. We might tear them apart in our struggle for control. And maybe that is where we're headed today. Maybe if we've lost confidence in the idea of forward momentum on this mechanism that forces us to balance, if we're convinced that the only real solution is to just pull the whole thing over to our side, then the ride is over. Instead, we're more in the position of two toddlers playing tug-of-war over a tricycle, trying to see who can seize it for themselves. And the most likely result of that is two crying toddlers, one of whom is holding a broken tricycle. Especially considering the kind of complex world we built up and how dependent our nation actually is on that cooperation. We staked our whole nation's identity on this idea of negotiation and cooperation and restraint and checks and balances. To pull that apart is to pull apart the entire thing that we were based on. It'd be a much bigger deal for us than it would for some other country where that's not really the basis of its organization. And the problem is it's actually really easy to do it. Breaking a mechanism of transportation, like a fine bicycle, that's just the work of a moment. Anyone could do it. Building one, putting one together is much harder. You go through a lot of stuff. Not everyone can do it. We have been through some difficult times as a nation. You should recognize, yeah, of course it hasn't been perfect. Why? Because we were trying to do something really hard. Ultimately really impressive, really productive, but really difficult, really experimental. But I think the fact that we were able to ride this bicycle a bit is one reason to say, maybe let's not just rip it to part at the first thing. Maybe you haven't really thought through the consequences. That is why I do think whatever your persuasion as a rider is, whether you're leaning toward the left or toward the right, it's worth trying to conserve the value of the thing that has brought you as far as you've come. Now, that doesn't mean you might not have ideas about how to improve it or steer it. You might have very good arguments for the adjustments that need to be made to help us navigate the road ahead successfully. But the mistake that you have to watch out for is thinking, I have got all the ideas. I have got all the insights. I have got all the vision. I have the only one true infallible path toward progress, and I don't have to share this vehicle with anyone else whose steering and ideas are remotely in conflict with my own. Forget even the other side of things, even people who aren't following me along within my side of things. I don't need any of that. That is the mistaken attitude that we need to really steer clear from. It is very, I'd say it's anti-human. I'd also say it's anti-American. It goes against the entire concept on which America is built. That is where the American system is pushing back, and that is why some people are getting frustrated, because they sense the system itself is actually fighting them and making it hard and making it long and frustrating, and I could just do things if it weren't for these people. Of course, you look at places where people do get everything that they wanted. You hear in California, of course, people complaining all the times about the conservatives, and how they can't get things done, but it's like they have a 100% like one-party state, basically. It doesn't mean it makes everything go perfectly or that everybody gets what they want, because actually life is complex and the problems are complex and people are complex. And so this proposed solution doesn't actually solve the problem. In fact, the best solution that we found for the problem was this systemic annoyance of the American system, because it's a system that's as annoying as the problems themselves. And so it helps you actually produce the right kind of solutions, because it antagonizes you the same way that life does. As I said, the American system has this interesting duality to it. It's pushing back against that unitary approach. It's more optimistic about the value of others than we might tend to be. And it's more pessimistic about your own virtues than you might want to be. It doesn't want to give you everything that you want. It wants to throw other people in and give them the ability to easily throw monkey wrenches in what you're trying to do. And as I say, that's both a pessimistic and optimistic approach. And that it gums up the works. It makes our system slow and awkward and cautious. It makes it hard to seize complete control of the mechanisms. It makes our political process very schizophrenic, as control vacillates back and forth between one side and the other, each side trying to pull down the other's accomplishments and drag things back to their control before it gets flipped the other way in the next few years. And if you're looking at us from the outside, probably look crazy. We probably do look like we're completely bipolar. But frankly, this is the price that our faith in the mechanisms of American government demands from us. That is the beauty and the power of our system, as silly as that sounds. In its bloody, blinkered frustration and hassle and restraint and inconsistency and bureaucracy, it probably sounds like madness, and maybe it is. But like I said, it is the madness that is humanity. And that's what life is actually like. It's a system that is as crazy as we are, that's as crazy as the world we live in. And oddly enough, it seems to have actually been a good match in its own way. It has forced us to work a little harder to get things worked out. And I think we've actually benefited from that. It's funny because this is a more recent thing, but I remember I was listening to Jonathan Haidt, and he was talking about science and about how certain scientific fields have become very unitary. They all have just one idea and one way. And so he said, basically, he called that systemic stupidity, which basically means it's no longer really scientific because you've all got these people who have predetermined what the answers to everything are and aren't questioning them effectively. You have no internal diversity of thought, so you have no ability for the system to correct itself or check itself or retest things because there's no one who wants to. There's no one who's interested in doing that. And so he called that systemic stupidity. And that was sort of how he wanted to apply that term to basically the way a lot of universities have gone. They become systemically stupid because they no longer have the ability to think complexly or with any kind of real criticism about any of its own dogma. Which, I'm not saying you don't uncover good, stable things and ideas that last for thousands of years, but even to the degree that it is important scientifically to test things, question things, can you reproduce that? There is also this sense in which things stagnate and things get taken for granted, including things that were never checked very thoroughly in the first place. They just become part of the assumed background. And nobody's pulling things out into consciousness and really looking at them. And they lose some of their life. And sometimes they actually have to be revivified by being stirred up a bit. And sometimes you need to force something to take a refreshed form. Anyway, so as I said, crazy system, but it's actually a system that is crazy good in many ways. So what we need to realize from this, as we think about how politically extreme should I be, how much should I commit to a side, I would say that the solution to the problems that life presents us with, if you're working inside the American system, isn't political control. It isn't we win everything. Because actually, according to the way the system is designed, increased universality of power and success would only lead to increased potential for dysfunction. More chances for you to become this systemically stupid version of whatever it is you're trying to do. Instead, within the American system, success is dependent on each of us being the best version, the best representative, the most productive and balanced and able to communicate and reason and work effectively with others version of who we are. It's actually a system that needs us, and it needs all of us, and it needs us all to be the best version of what we are, to be the most challenged and tested and refined version of what we are, not to just be everything. The solution isn't for you to be everything. It's for you to be who you are, but be the best version of that. And best able to communicate, best able to work with others. As I said, best able to learn, best able to teach. And that's I think that's a good thing. It means we don't have to be everybody and everything. That's good because we aren't. Thinking that we are is one of the worst mistakes we can make. And what a relief it is to discover we don't have to carry the whole burden of the totality of the universe just in ourselves. We just need to be the best version of us. The most educated, cautious, controlled, well-meaning, dedicated, humble, invested, understanding, courageous, generally virtuous version of what we are. That's what America needs. Whatever our personal bent is, we need to be the most adult version of that thing, the least pathological version of that thing, the least crazy version of that thing. And we need to recognize also that there's a version of that, a different version of that, that we actually need from other people, from the people who are different from us. We actually need the best version of them. And like I said, it's like a relationship. For a town to succeed, we don't need everybody to be the shopkeeper. We need the shopkeeper to be the best shopkeeper. And we need, the baker to be the best baker. We need the farmers to be the best farmers. That's what we really want to unleash, that potential for each to become the best of what they are, not for everything to become exactly the same thing. Same thing, we don't want there to be nothing but women. We don't want nothing but men. We want women to be the best women. We want men to be the best men. Why? Because together they'll actually benefit each other the most. It'll be great. We need to recognize that each of us don't have a monopoly on being virtuous just by being the particular thing that we are, rather than how well are you doing the thing that you are. We just have a specialization. We have a specialization in being the best version of us. That doesn't tell the whole complete story of what people could be. We tell our bit that here is how I can be the best version of us. And in that way, you get this balance, actually, between these two levels. You get the universal, you get the transcendent, you get the stuff that connects us all. This common pursuit of virtue, but it's individualized for each person. So you get both the individualist and the universalist. You're actually getting them at their proper levels and at their proper places. It's when those get confused, when you say, the transcendent things are actually all individualist. They're all completely solipsistic. Or you get down and say, the individual people, we are all universal. We are the thing that should be everything. That's where you've got things backwards. You're putting each in the wrong place. You want individual people, universal, transcendent qualities that find these individual expressions. Anyway, so that really, as I said, this idea of this development of individual virtues, but differing ones, individualized maybe, as the virtue is more of a universal concept, but it's individualized through different people. They're unique expressions of it. It's, what's this look like for the particular thing that you are? That, I think, really is the foundation, and the foundation of America, for this theory of how government and society could work. It's the idea behind the American Constitution. It's also the reason I feel obligated, as someone who's trying to do well, and as an American, to oppose the extreme, the unbalanced, the childish, the unvirtuous, wherever it rears its head, whether it's on the right or on the left. Now, I'm slightly a more middle-of-the-road person, maybe, than average myself. I have a personality that's kind of split down the middle. If you're familiar with something like the Enneagram, at the very bottom of it, there's the sort of personality abyss, this big gulf between these two things that are at an extreme, and I'm split right over that abyss. And also in my experience, I would say I grew up as a kind of disruptive and liberal personality influence in a highly conservative environment. Very high in openness, personality-wise myself, tested off the charts for that. Grew up in, small town rural America. And so I was a sort of, I liked pushing back. I liked poking at things. I like saying, why did we do that? What happens if I don't do that? And I liked taking down the shibboleths a little bit. Like I said, it was a little disruptive and a little liberal in this more conservative environment, but I nevertheless deeply appreciated and was invested in that environment. I wasn't out to destroy it. And I didn't see it as necessarily rejecting me, although there was often tension. No, that was my home. I loved those people, even for the ways that we're different. That was part of us. That was part of the dynamic, In a way, it made who I was more meaningful. Because I felt like I really was contributing something. And I felt like it was really contributing something to me, that there was something for me to listen to, and for me to learn that was not my natural bent. But as I say, being someone who's a little split between the sides of things, I found that that actually made me doubly vulnerable. So I sort of had some of the tendencies of both sides. I had some of the experience of both sides, and I realized over time that actually meant that I had a propensity for making the mistakes and the errors of both sides. That I could actually doubly reinforce my failings on top of themselves, and I can tip myself into pathology from both angles. So one thing I would say is one great advantage of being a person who shares the weaknesses of both liberals and of conservatives is that it's a little easier for me to see when both sides are making the same or complementary mistakes, because I can find both those errors so easily within my own heart. I can easily see the reflection of my own worst self in those sorts of arguments. I am constantly and forever falling off one side or the other, making one set of mistakes and then the other set of mistakes. And I go through periods of my life, or even just moments in a day, where, oops, I just fell off this side. Oops, I just fell off this side. I have really fallen off both sides of the horse. I make one side's a mistake, then the other. I fail to listen to one side, then I fail to listen to the other side. I go way too stupidly too far with one criticism, and then I go too stupidly too far with the other criticism. I have thoroughly proved my failure, and I have delegitimized myself and committed grave errors from both sides of the political spectrum, both sides of the ideological spectrum. I have called both sides idiots. And I have said about both sides that they need to be defeated. I have taken for granted too much the side that I was defending from all angles. I've done that. I've done it all. I've made all the mistakes, and I continue to make all the mistakes. I'm still making all the mistakes right now. And so I'd say the only thing I bring to the table is a certain Socratic ignorance of realizing, oh, I have not got this figured out, but I've realized that I am making all the mistakes, and that makes it a little easier to see that wherever it rears its head. Like America itself, I have become afraid and untrusting of myself, and I have at times lost my faith because of my mistakes. I have feared my own excesses, and I've lost confidence in the mechanism. I've let it drag me into, nihilism and despair and skepticism. I've been afraid to go forward. I've been afraid to value or give voice to certain sides of me because of where that's gone in the past, and because of how I think people might react to it, or because what I'm worried I might do with it, that I'm going to go crazy in this way, or I'm going to go crazy in that way. It's very easy to get paralyzed from having that kind of experience. And I feel that in my own heart and in my own experience, but I think you can feel that way about the whole country too. And I'm not even saying it's necessarily wrong, but where does that go? One lesson, though, that I'd say I've taken from this is that it's the battles that we fight with ourselves that are really the most important, not the battles that we fight with others. And that the battles that we fight with what we love matter the most, because that's where the greatest difference and the greatest change and what's going to happen, that's where it really lies, between the great and the terrible versions of who we could be. Maybe I'm wrong, but I often feel that the greatest differences between us aren't those differences that lie on the surface between, some sort of shallow group or class like race, nationality, whatever, but that there's actually deeper, more fundamental differences another layer down from that, just between individual people, between vastly differing personalities. If you haven't spent much time talking to people, people are very different. They have very different approaches, very different things that notice, that they bother them, that they respond to, that they value, very different strengths, very different weaknesses. So yes, below these general categories, when you actually say types of people, whoa, there's even bigger differences. The differences don't get smaller, they get bigger. And I wonder if there's an even deeper place where the true differences are even greater. And those differences are within the individual, between who they could be and who they choose to be. That, I think, is where the greatest gulf of all lies, in the ability of a single human heart or mind to turn this way or that way, to give in to the easiest impulses or to give rise to its greatest aspirations. So that's very much like Dostoevsky said, I believe, was it? No, I can't remember if it was Dostoevsky or from the Gulag, no, I think it was maybe from the Gulag Archipelago, that the line of good and evil is drawn down every human heart. There's many lines drawn. We do have these lines drawn between groups and classes of people, but guess what? You jump down to people, there's huge lines and divisions between people, and then pull down to another level within a person, who you could be, what you could become. That's actually where the biggest differences of all are. And I think that's something some people have recognized, that, including people like Martin Luther King. He said that judging people by our content of our character, why did he focus on that? Because that's basically speculating that it is in our character that we differ the most, that the most difference is possible, that we change the most, that the most true diversity exists, is in character. So if that's the case, that it's actually in our character, within ourselves, that there is the most difference possible. If that's the case, I think it's also the truth that it's there within ourselves that we can also share the most. Because it's in our common struggle with our own natures, in our desire to be the better version of who we could be. That's a place where we can be the most united, as well as we are the most potentially divided. So that's where the greatest unity and the greatest division can occur, within a single human heart, within you, within that struggle within you. And then above that, you do have those individual differences, and I think that there's more unity as well as division in those individual differences. And then it's when you jump up to things like, nationality, class, these sorts of these real big abstractions, very shallow abstractions, where you actually have the least and the shallowest divisions. So I do think difference and similarity do exist at all of these levels, and all of them are significant. All of them matter, and they all contribute to sympathy and antipathy between us. The widest, most obvious differences and similarities exist at the shallowest level, but they seem large because of the ease with which they can be identified and collected in our minds. Some things are just easy to see and sort of count and take the gist of. It actually takes a much deeper knowledge of a person to even begin to discover that second layer, their particular sort of person that they are. And it requires true intimacy, with someone to really discover that third. You have to really, some people never let other people inside that third layer of who are you, how have you become, who could have you have become, which way could things go, what struggles have you been through in navigating those choices, the you that could be, the you that is, the you that might be. That is a far deeper level up, and it's the hardest one to actually see, even though it's the most important. It's the one where the most actual difference is taking place, but it's the hardest to see. It takes the most work. Where we often go wrong with people is in trying to just too hastily to assign understanding that we haven't really earned on one level based on our understanding of another. So we've glanced at the shallow level and we think that means we know everything down to the deepest level. That's just sort of a mistake in understanding. That's where we come to misunderstand each other. Just because you know that I'm part of this broad group doesn't mean that you know me in detail as the particular sort of person that I am. And just because you maybe you know me a bit better, maybe you do know the particular sort of person I am, doesn't mean that you know what I've done and what I could do or what I could be. That takes some extra knowledge, takes some extra intimacy. And I'm also not going to say that all those sorts of leaps and assumptions are unreasonable. They're often very necessary because there really are limits to how much we can know. And there's also a limit to how many people we can know it about. We often are forced to make kind of quick judgments about things and even make kind of formulas and heuristics in our mind, because there is an infinite amount of things to know. And there is an almost infinite amount of things to know about even just one person. I mean, how long might you spend learning all the depths about a spouse or a brother or a sister or your parent? How many years does it actually take to get through all those levels with them? A lot. And you know what? We're very finite people. We have to navigate. So yeah, we have to find ways to get along. So I'm not saying that we don't have to do that to some degree. In life, we do have to make judgment calls, and sometimes we have to make them based on shallower criteria than we would really like. We have to make a best guess sometimes, or a rule of thumb. That's part of life. That's part of what our brains are designed to do. Of course, you need to try to have good rules of thumb, and you need to be willing to revisit them and improve them. But doing without them, you couldn't walk out your door because you're assuming so much about your environment. At any given moment, you're assuming your rules of thumb about 99.99% of everything and everyone. That's just life, But I do think we can benefit from remembering that there are these different levels, that they exist, and that it is worth being humble and cautious about how easily we feel confidence in assigning judgment at one level based on work that we really only did at another. So what do we really need? I would say what we really need is, because as I said, we have to walk out the door. We have to live in the world, in this infinitely complex world of finite attention, time, and knowledge. You do have to walk out the door. So how do we do that? I would say what we need is wisdom. And wisdom isn't a function of which group you're part of or who you are, the particular type of person that you are, or even how smart you are. Those two aren't necessarily correlated. There's small wisdom, there's great wisdom, there's many kinds of wisdom and different ways to acquire it from all sorts of people, because I think it is something that's available to all people. There's wisdom that's arrived at slowly, that you bought with great personal pain. There's innate wisdom. There's inherited wisdom that gets handed down to you. I think that what wisdom is, it's a matter of finding some echo of the balance within. So this balance that I'm talking about, this systemic wisdom, I think would be the opposite to systemic stupidity. Systemic wisdom is knowing how to walk, how to be, it's a living thing. Wisdom isn't a static thing. Wisdom is a living thing. It knows how to navigate. It can go places. It can see, it can respond. It is dynamic. And then that's opposed to, things like systemic stupidity, which has become locked into place. So what we are trying to do when we are trying to become wise is actually trying to find some internal version of this external wisdom, this systemic wisdom that we're trying to put together without. The good organization of all these things, finding a way to internalize that and find that balance within. It's the small ways in which your own wobble gets a little bit closer to the center of the tension, where it becomes the best version of that, where this harmony of interlocking and balance and complexity finds some fulfillment, some image within our own divided hearts and minds. We're always going to be limited, we're always going to be finite, we're always going to be particular, but wisdom is trying to find the image of that and imprint it onto our own hearts in as much as we can. And I think that the process that we seek to enforce, to produce wisdom outside us, is actually the same process by which we try to find it within ourselves. They're a reflection of one another, as I say. Now, as for myself, I'm not exceptionally clever, and I'm certainly not exceptionally virtuous. As I said, I have a proclivity for being wrong in every way that you could think of. And it's wrong in enough different ways. Maybe it's just a tiny bit easier for me sometimes to see where things are going wrong. Because I am constantly seeing it going wrong in all those different ways in myself. And so I can find it within me to both love and to struggle with both liberal and conservative viewpoints. And I do want to return to what I said about the most important battles and where the biggest difference happened are the nearer they are to us, the more intimate they are, the battles we fight within our own heart. And also then I'd say the battles we fight with those things that are more common to us, the things that are like us, the people that are like us. The fights that we make with, not for, what we love and what we identify with are the dearest to us because they're a fight for who we want to be. It's a fight for the better or the worse version of us, either as individuals or as this group of like-minded individuals. And I will say that during some of the Trump years, I had a hard time not hating Trumpist conservatism because it took something that I really loved, something that I was for, and it turned it into what to me seemed to be the worst, least defensible, least understandable and lovable, least helpful version of itself. And at the same time, I had a hard time not hating the woke, postmodernist, politically correct cancel culture because I saw it as just squandering and subverting the value of liberalism. I wanted to live in a better version of conservatism than what I saw being handed me by Trump. And I wanted to inhabit a better version of liberalism than what I was being handed by these far-left woke Democrats. I wanted them to be versions of themselves that helped and complemented and balanced one another, not that just smacked each other in the head and hated each other and had no need to listen or apologize or understand, no reason to say we don't need those people. We can I can be president of half of America, and I very much have heard that from both Trump and Biden, is this sort of like, I only need the base. I don't need most of the country, and I just didn't want to live inside that vision of America. I didn't think it was, I don't think it's sustainable as a vision of America. And this is something I want to talk about. I'll do it in a separate post sometime. I'm very much against the proliferation of different versions of flags of America, because having a different versions of the American flag whose entire concept is this unity and diversity of 50 completely different things all gathered together in one in unity. Now you're suddenly making subversions of it that defeats the entire idea behind the flag, that defeats the entire idea behind America. In America, we can have flags. We have state flags. We have all this individualism. You can have all the flags that you want. You can make a million different flags. You're in America. Great work. Express yourself. But you can't make different versions, opposing versions of the American flag, because that is a contradiction in terms. That is a contradiction of the idea that the American flag itself represents. What you have is no longer the American flag. It is completely taking apart the entire concept. And as I say, I don't want to live in that version of conservatism. I don't want to live in that version of liberalism. And I don't think America can survive either of them. I want the left and the right to be those versions of each other that help one another, that complement one another, that balance one another. I want to be able to step safely into and out of one or another of them and learn something without getting trapped or thrown out or entangled in some sort of solipsistic extremity. I want a vision for a common virtue of humanity that actually stands across and is bigger than both of the political parties. And I have to believe that it still exists, because I think that's what it means to believe in America. I also think that that's something, if you are religious, if you are a Christian, that is actually something you are called to. You're called to something bigger and more transcendent than just this party. Like those are only those. Nothing that is less than everything should be held up as being everything. That is idolatry. That is the fundamental idea of, that Judaism spent years trying to bang into people's heads. And I think the instinct to say this thing that isn't everything is idolatry. And I don't care whether you're coming from the left or the right about it. Anyway. As I said, I have to believe that this common virtue of humanity that is greater than just the left-right divide does exist. Maybe its time is running short. Maybe the window for accessing it is closing. The movement of humanity as a race may be away from it. But I think it's still possible. We just might need to suffer to relearn the lessons of its value. Now, if we can't remind ourselves of the value of this thing that we gained soon, I don't know what will happen. Unfortunately, I am not myself a hugely courageous person. I also don't really want to be in charge of things. I confess I'm afraid of both sides. I'm afraid of the conservatives and I'm afraid of the liberals. I'm afraid to offend either of them, make either of them upset. I don't really want to fight either of them that much. I don't. Like I said, I'm not this. I'm a bit of a coward. I've got the weaknesses and flaws of both sides. I've got the fear of both sides. I'm cynical from my experiences. I am lazy. I'm not really doing my part to ensure a better tomorrow. Probably most people would say but there's better people than me out there on both sides and in the middle. Seeing the worst of both sides in myself can make me feel more cynical than I really should. But there is hope. There are plenty of people who are actually being driven away from the extremes, who are abandoning them for a moderate, if still divided middle. And that's fine. There should be this divisions. That should be one of your fundamental things. But a division that still makes room for cooperation. And I'm not saying there aren't things that shouldn't be opposed in any political vision. Sometimes you need to fight the other side like hell, because they are going to pull you down. And sometimes you need to be willing to fight your own side too for its soul, so that it becomes the best version of what it could be. So that your own, how it's one thing to have the side that you're not for pull things down. At least you can say, well, don't blame me, I voted for Kodos, to quote from The Simpsons. But how much worse and how more humiliating is it if you didn't take responsibility for your own side, and your own side ends up pulling things down because you didn't have the courage to stand up to those in sympathy with you, to your own friends, that you didn't take any responsibility to ensure that you and them were the best version of you that you could be, that you didn't take for granted that you were perfect and wouldn't make any mistakes of your own. What we really need to rediscover is the best way to oppose one another in a way that keeps us moving forward and not falling over. And anyway, that's all I have to say about it. This is my vision for why I eschew all political extremes and oppose all political extremes, but at the same time am skeptical of even the existence of complete moderation, although I think that in a way, finding that within ourselves is part of the process of being wise. It's a complicated thing. Life is a complicated thing. We need to acknowledge the things that are true and work our way through them. And it's not going to be formulaic. It's not going to be just a simple, easy answer, because we are not so simple. Life is not so simple. So our response and our understanding of how to navigate those challenges needs to be at least as complicated and crazy as we are. And that's all I have to say for today. We'll see you next time.